Ethnically, if you take the DNA of Moroccans, they're not Arab. There's probably some Arab blood there, but it's a small amount, 5% max. Same with Algeria, same with Egypt, same with Syria. Syria had a significant Arab population, but the majority of the population wasn't. They were Assyrian, they were Greek, they were Roman, they were Persian. And so what you ended up with was a huge swath of land that spoke Arabic, that had become majority Muslim, but ethnically it wasn't Arab.
For centuries, maps drew a hard line between Africa and Arabia, as if the Red Sea had always been a wall. History books named conquests, dynasties, caravans, caliphates, language followed empire, religion followed trade, and identity followed memory. But DNA does not read memory. DNA does not care what a nation calls itself, what a tribe preserves in oral history, or what a modern headline needs in order to go viral. So when a claim appears saying that scientists have finally proved which Africans are the most Arab, it lands with the force of a verdict. It sounds final, clean, measurable, almost dangerous in its certainty. But the deeper the science goes, the less simple the story becomes. Because North Africa is not one ancestry. The Horn of Africa is not one ancestry. The Swahili coast is not one ancestry. Even Arabia is not one ancestry. The genomes tell a story of crossings older than Islam, migrations older than Arab empires, and identity shifts that sometimes happened with people moving, and sometimes happened with language moving faster than blood. Then came the new tools: ancient DNA, full genome sequencing, statistical modeling, even AI-assisted demographic reconstruction. Suddenly, researchers could compare deep ancestry, estimate time windows, and test migration scenarios that would have sounded impossible a generation ago. And yet, the most important result was not a winner. It was a warning, because the closer science gets to ancestry, the more it reveals a truth many would rather avoid. Identity is real, but it is not reducible to a percentage. Culture is inherited, but not always genetically. And the label Arab may describe language, history, political belonging, tribe, or homeland far more than it describes a single biological category. So the real mystery is not whether Africans and Arabs are connected. They clearly are. The real mystery is this: when DNA enters the courtroom of identity, what exactly is it qualified to prove? It is firmly established that Arabic language and Arab political influence spread into Africa beginning in the 7th century, especially through Egypt and across North Africa after the rise of Islam. Over time, Arabic became dominant in many regions that had earlier linguistic and cultural layers, including Amazigh-speaking areas in North Africa. That part is not speculative, it is historical. It is also confirmed that modern North African populations are genetically heterogeneous. They are not a single Arab bloc. Reviews of North African genomics consistently describe the region as a mosaic shaped by ancient local ancestry, back to Africa movements, links to the Near East, Mediterranean inputs, and sub-Saharan African gene flow across different eras. That means any attempt to rank all Africans by a single Arab DNA scale is already colliding with a far more complicated genetic landscape. Meanwhile, large genomic studies of the Middle East show that even Arabic-speaking populations are genetically diverse. In one major study, Arabian Peninsula populations clustered differently from Levantine groups, and both differed in their ancestral components and later admixture histories. In plain terms, Arabic speaking does not mean genetically identical even within the Arab world itself. There is also confirmed evidence of deep cross-Red Sea interaction. A study focused on mitochondrial DNA in the Horn of Africa concluded that Eurasian-related ancestry entered the region through multiple episodes, with some maternal lineages likely arriving from Arabian refugia during the late glacial period, long before the Islamic era. That means some African-Arabian genetic connections predate Arab identity in its historical sense by thousands of years. And on the East African coast, ancient DNA from medieval Swahili sites showed a different kind of connection. A mixed society in which African ancestry remained central while Asian contributions, initially mostly Persian and Indian and later more Arabian, became part of the story after about 1000 CE, with Arabian influence increasing after about 1500 CE. This is highly relevant, but it is not the same as proving that one present-day African population is the most Arab. Where the debate begins is not over whether Africa and Arabia interacted. The debate is over scale, timing, and meaning. One major question is how much of North African Arabization was demographic and how much was cultural. Did large numbers of people from the Arabian Peninsula permanently reshape the gene pool across the Maghreb? Or did Arabic language and Arab identity spread partly through elite dominance, religion, trade, and social prestige, leaving more limited genetic input in some regions than popular imagination assumes? Researchers continue to test this with genome-wide data, and results often point to a mixture of both, varying by region. Another debate concerns the Horn of Africa. For years, some models dated major West Eurasian-related admixture there to around 3,000 years ago. But mitochondrial studies have argued that parts of that ancestry may reflect multiple, older migrations, some tied more closely to Arabia, others to Egypt or the Levant. In other words, even when a population shows affinity to Arabia, the ancestry may not be exclusively Arab in the historical sense, and may not come from one single migration event. A third debate is definitional. What does Arab mean in a genetics paper? In one of the most important recent Middle East genomic studies, the researchers explicitly used labels like Arabian as geographic and linguistic shorthand for sampled populations, not as proof of a singular biological essence. That caution matters. A paper can compare Saudis, Yemenis, Emiratis, Levantines, and Iraqi Arabs, but it cannot turn a cultural category into a clean genetic species. This is where the internet tends to sprint past the data. The most common speculative leap is the idea that one DNA test can finally certify which African group is most Arab, as though identity were a race with a finish line. No major scholarly source establishes such a universal ranking. Studies identify gradients, affinities, clines, admixture events, and comparative relationships. They do not issue certificates of ultimate Arabness. Another speculative claim is that science has uncovered a hidden truth that authorities refuse to admit. In reality, the caution seen in academic writing is usually methodological, not conspiratorial. Scientists hesitate because the categories are messy, the reference populations matter, and ancestry signals can reflect ancient Near Eastern links, later Arabian gene flow, or both. And the most misleading theory of all is the idea that DNA can settle culture. It cannot. It can illuminate migrations. It can estimate shared ancestry. It can reveal that a community's story is older, broader, or more entangled than expected. But it cannot decide who belongs spiritually, linguistically, historically, or politically to an identity as layered as Arab. The anomaly begins with the title itself. It promises a scientific knockout, a final answer, a shocking reveal. But the science underneath this topic keeps resisting that kind of ending. If the question is asked in historical terms, the answer changes by century. If it is asked in linguistic terms, it changes by state. If it is asked in genetic terms, it changes by which ancestry markers are measured, which comparison populations are used, and whether the study is looking at maternal lines, paternal lines, or whole genomes. North Africa complicates the question because Arab identity there often sits on top of much deeper local ancestry. The Horn complicates it because Arabian-related ancestry may be ancient, layered, and not reducible to later Islamic era migration. The Swahili coast complicates it because foreign ancestry did enter, but in a highly specific maritime context that does not map neatly onto modern ethnic claims. And then there is the deepest inconsistency of all. Some of the populations popularly imagined as most Arab may carry substantial ancestry that predates Arabization, while some populations with documented Arabian-related admixture may not define themselves primarily through Arab identity at all. That is the curiosity gap. The data is real, the connection is real, but the headline formula does not hold. What science reveals is not a single winner. It reveals overlapping histories of migration, conversion, language shift, marriage, trade, conquest, and memory. And in that overlap, the simple question begins to fall apart. The breakthrough did not come from a single swab in a lab. It came from a new generation of methods. In recent years, researchers moved beyond older ancestry testing models and began using full genome data, ancient DNA comparisons, and demographic simulations, sophisticated enough to test entire historical scenarios. One widely reported 2024 study on North African populations used complete genomes and an AI-assisted computational framework to compare models of population history. Its conclusion was provocative. The genetic differentiation between present-day Amazigh and Arab-identifying populations in North Africa may reach far deeper than a simple medieval split, while much of the more recent Arab-associated genetic signal was linked to the period of Arabization beginning in the 7th century AD, with an east-to-west gradient. That matters because it reframes the question. Instead of asking which Africans are most Arab, the better question becomes, where do researchers detect more recent Arabian-related admixture layered onto older African and back-to-Africa ancestries? By that standard, the strongest cases often point not to one people, but to zones. Arab-speaking populations in North Africa, especially those historically closer to Eastern entry points, show measurable links to Middle Eastern gene flow, but those signals sit inside a regionally mixed genomic landscape. The result is not a badge of purity, it is a map of contact. If AI enters the story, it must be described honestly. AI can help search huge genetic datasets, compare competing demographic models, and identify which historical scenario best fits the observed data. AI can accelerate inference. It can sharpen pattern recognition, but AI cannot independently define what Arab means, cannot read culture from genes, and cannot remove the uncertainty built into reference samples, ancient population gaps, or political identity. It is a tool for model testing, not an oracle of civilization. This is the moment where the documentary pivots, not from ignorance to certainty, but from myth to precision. Because the new discovery is not that science has crowned one African population the most Arab. The new discovery is that the old question was too crude for the evidence now available. But this is where the stakes rise. Because once genetics enters identity debates, the science stops living only in journals. It starts moving through politics, pride, grievance, and sometimes humiliation. Communities hear ancestry claims as arguments about legitimacy. Nations hear them as arguments about origin. Online audiences hear them as weapons. And experts know this. That is why the language of serious papers is so careful. Some researchers are willing to say that Arab-associated gene flow into parts of North Africa was more recent and more measurable than older theories suggested. Others emphasize that North African ancestry cannot be understood without its deeper local substrate. In the Horn, some highlight Arabian-related signals. Others stress Levantine or Northeastern African mediation, or multiple waves too old to identify with later Arab identity. In short, the experts disagree, not because the data is fake, but because the history is layered. Institutions are cautious for another reason. Public DNA interpretation has limits. Consumer ancestry tests, and even some simplified media summaries often turn probabilistic findings into hard labels. A person may receive a result suggesting affinity to a modern reference population, but that does not mean an ancestor literally belonged to that present-day identity. Reference panels change. Statistical categories evolve. Entire regions are undersampled. What looks dramatic in a screenshot may be less dramatic in peer review. Then there is the uncomfortable question of terminology. If Arab identity can be tribal, linguistic, religious, national, or cultural, who gets to decide when genetics is relevant? A genome study can compare Arabic-speaking populations. It cannot settle how those populations should understand themselves. That is why the most responsible scientists do not use DNA to erase identity. They use DNA to complicate it, And that complication frustrates audiences trained by headlines to expect a reveal, a twist, a verdict. But the truth does not always arrive as a verdict. Sometimes it arrives as a narrower claim that overturns a louder myth. The conventional academic interpretation is that many Arab-speaking populations in Africa, especially in North Africa, reflect a combination of deep local ancestry, plus later Middle Eastern gene flow associated with historical Arabization. In this view, there is no single African people that science has proved to be the most Arab. There are instead populations with varying degrees of Arabian or Near Eastern affinity, shaped by geography and history. Eastern North Africa generally had more direct exposure first, with gradients weakening westward. A more expansive alternative theory argues that some African groups in the Horn or along the Red Sea preserve older Arabian-linked ancestry that predates Islam and may even precede what most people mean by Arab. For this interpretation, the question is too historically shallow. The real story is not Arabization alone, but repeated cross-Red Sea movement over thousands of years. If so, some of the strongest Arabian-related genetic ties in Africa may be ancient, fragmented, and hidden beneath later identities. The skeptical position pushes back harder. It says the entire phrase, "most Arab," is scientifically incoherent. Since Arab identity is not a single biological type, any ranking is misleading from the start. Genetic proximity to some present-day Arabian reference populations does not equal cultural Arabness, and cultural Arabness does not require strong recent Arabian ancestry. A community may be fully Arab in language and identity without being reducible to a genetic score. This view is strongly supported by the caution embedded in major population genomic studies of the Middle East. What makes the topic powerful is that all three interpretations contain part of the truth. Yes, there was historical Arab migration into Africa. Yes, there were older cross-Red Sea links long before that. And yes, the entire effort to rank identity through DNA can become misleading if the language is not kept under control. Why does this matter so much? Because origin stories are never just about the past. They are about belonging in the present. For some, a DNA result feels like validation. For others, it feels like theft. A language spoken at home, a religion practiced for centuries, a family name carried with pride, an oral history preserved against empire and time. None of these are easily replaced by a chart of admixture percentages. And yet the chart still exerts power because it appears objective. That is the emotional gravity of this subject. Science arrives wearing the costume of certainty, but history keeps whispering that human identity was never built that way. The deeper lesson may be this: Africa and Arabia were never strangers. They were neighbors, trading partners, rivals, settlers, pilgrims, conquerors, spouses, and witnesses to each other's transformations. The Red Sea separated them, yes, but it also connected them. The Sahara isolated some communities, and trade routes bound others together. Across centuries, language could spread without total replacement. Genes could move without erasing local roots. Memory could preserve one origin, while biology preserved many. So what changes after the latest research? Not the dignity of any people, not the legitimacy of identity. What changes is the level of honesty demanded by the evidence. The evidence says the story is mixed. The evidence says labels arrived at different times than lineages. The evidence says ancestry is real, but ancestry is not destiny. And perhaps that is what unsettles audiences most. Not that the answer is shocking, but that the real answer refuses to flatter simplicity. So if science cannot truly prove which Africans are the most Arab, what has it actually revealed? It has revealed that African-Arab connections are ancient, repeated, and undeniable. It has revealed that Arabization in Africa was sometimes demographic, sometimes cultural, and often both. It has revealed that North Africa, the Horn, and the Swahili coast each tell different versions of the same larger human story. Identities that look solid from a distance often become intricate under the microscope. And that leaves one unresolved question hanging in the silence. When a people's language, memory, and history say one thing, and their DNA tells a more entangled story, which truth should matter more? Perhaps the most provocative statement is also the most human one. The closer science gets to origins, the less it discovers purity, and the more it discovers relationship. The final judgment, then, does not belong to a headline. It belongs to the evidence and to the audience willing to wrestle with it. The comments remain open for every interpretation.